More than a century ago, Carl Jung noticed something terrifying. Among his most unstable, most dangerous patients, nearly 3/4 showed the same warning sign before they collapsed. Not a violent act, not a threat, but an invisible fracture, a shift of the mind that turns reality into a distorted mirror. He called it the projection of the shadow. And he said that by the time you see it appear, it's already too late to reason. You must leave. Get away. Because this shadow is not an abstract idea. It's a psychological contagion capable of destroying everything it touches. It all began with a patient in 1913. An intelligent man, polite, almost charming in his manner. He claimed to be attentive to others, deeply moral, sincerely concerned for the good. But Jung noticed a disturbing detail. Every person this man described as toxic or manipulative had exactly the traits he refused to recognize in himself. What he condemned in others was what he silently carried within his own unconscious. And the more he projected, the more he believed his own stories. Within 6 months, he had destroyed his relationships, lost his job, shattered his family, all while seeing himself as a victim. Convinced he was surrounded by enemies, he couldn't see that he had become the very thing he feared. Jung then realized he had uncovered one of the most dangerous mechanisms of the human mind, the shadow projected with absolute certainty. And modern science would later prove him right. Decades after him, neuroscience showed that when a person projects their shadow, the brain regions related to reality perception reorganize themselves. In other words, the brain literally reshapes the world to match its belief. That's why such people seem so convincing. They aren't acting, they truly live in a parallel reality. Their certainty becomes a magnetic field, and the more they believe, the more they draw others into their illusion. That's how a wounded mind can infect an entire group. Maybe you've experienced it yourself. Someone accuses you of intentions you never had. You try to explain, to reason, but every word becomes proof against you. You feel reality slipping beneath your feet. You start doubting yourself. That moment, Jung called it the field of reality distortion, a psychological space where the conviction of one person can overturn the perception of everyone else. This phenomenon isn't new. Spiritual traditions had already glimpsed it. Buddhists spoke of the inner shadow reflected upon the world. Christians said, "Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye but fail to notice the beam in your own?" But Jung went further. He understood that these projections don't just distort truth, they create entire realities. It begins with a subtle disconnection. Someone starts describing to you thoughts you've never had, emotions that aren't yours. And they do it with such conviction that you begin to doubt your own mind. It's no longer conscious manipulation. It's a disconnection from reality, a psychic fog where the unconscious takes control. Jung observed how these individuals then recruit others into their distorted vision. Gradually, their surroundings begin to see the world through their eyes. He called this collective possession. And that's when projection becomes a social phenomenon, a shared illusion, a kind of group delusion, where an entire circle defends a false reality with the fervor of truth. The danger is that the more convinced a person is, the more influence they gain. And faced with such certainty, most people would rather yield than confront doubt. That's how entire families unite against one member. How co-workers reject someone without knowing why. How entire communities destroy innocent individuals simply because a projection took root. But projection is only the first doorway of the shadow. Jung discovered others even more troubling. The most formidable is ego inflation. The moment someone stops merely projecting their darkness and begins to believe they are the light itself. These people never doubt. They see themselves as guided by a higher mission. They speak of truth, purity, morality. But behind their noble words, their ego is swollen until it merges with the absolute. They aren't always loud or arrogant. Sometimes they're charismatic, spiritual, inspiring, but their conviction is a trap. They cannot bear contradiction. For them, disagreement equals error, even evil. They become the saviors of those they will eventually destroy. And before their facade collapses, they leave behind them a field of psychological ruins. Another trap, more discreet still, is identification with the persona. Jung called it the problem of the perfect person. It's someone who has invested all their energy into their social image. Always polite, always fair, always appropriate. Never a misplaced word, never a visible flaw. But behind that perfection, no one remains. The shadow repressed builds up in the unconscious like pressure in a sealed vessel. And when it explodes, it's chaos. The smoother the mask, the more violent the explosion. Then there are archetypal possessions. Those moments when a person ceases to be themselves and becomes the voice of an impersonal force. Their gaze changes, their voice changes. They speak with the authority of the prophet, the warrior, or the saint. But that energy is not human. And Jung said, the same power that creates saints also creates fanatics. The one who believes himself chosen often becomes the shadow of what he sought to fight. Finally, there is the compulsion to repeat, that invisible mechanism that drives some people to relive the same dramas, the same failures, the same wounds again and again. They believe they are victims of fate, but in truth they are unconsciously replaying an old script. And if you enter their life, you may become a character in it. Without realizing, you'll play the role of the traitor, the savior, or the persecutor in a story written long before you arrived. So how can one protect themselves? Jung said the key is awareness, staying lucid even when reality seems to twist, trusting your intuition, not trying to convince those who have lost touch with themselves, limiting what you share, and sometimes leaving without looking back. Because some battles aren't won through confrontation, but through silence. The patient who marked Jung so deeply wasn't evil. He was simply unable to face the dark part of himself. Instead of confronting it, he had projected it onto the whole world. And in his search for purity, he became what he feared. That is the paradox of the human psyche. What we refuse to see within ourselves always manifests outside of us. But the moment we become conscious of it, the spell breaks. The light of awareness dissolves the inner lie. Jung didn't want to frighten us, he wanted to free us. Free us from unconscious manipulation, from projection fields, from the collective illusions that govern us. The real danger is not the shadow itself. It's the unconsciousness of the shadow and the absolute conviction that our perception is the only truth. When you meet someone who speaks with that icy certainty, remember what Jung said. The most terrifying thing is not to encounter the shadow. It is to refuse to see it within oneself. For those who cannot fully accept themselves, project their inner hell onto those around them. Your only protection is awareness. to recognize what belongs to you and refuse to carry what does not. That, Jung said, is where true freedom begins, the freedom of a mind finally reconciled with its own shadow.